Good morning to all of you, or good evening or afternoon for the people who are following us on Zoom. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I'm the director of the Institute of European Studies. I would like to welcome all of you to Philosophy Hall for today's event. An event with Sarah Adams. Allow me to say just a few words about today's speaker. Sarah is an FBO postdoctoral researcher at Ghent and Antwerp universities in Belgium. And her current project focuses on the poetics and politics of comic stage blackness in Dutch popular culture before the heyday of Minster City. She's currently a visiting scholar here at our institute, and I'm very excited to learn more about her forthcoming book. I just heard from Sarah that the book is coming out next week. So she's giving us a preview on the book that is about to be published, a book that is entitled Repertoires of Slavery. So we're all very excited, Sarah, to hear more about your book, and I'm sure there will be plenty of questions for the Q&A after the presentation. So please join me in welcoming Sarah.
So my notes are on my computer, that's why I'm here. My laptop. So yes, as Jeroen already said, my first monologue will come out next week, and I hope just in time that I will be able to hand over a copy to the Institute as a sign of gratitude for having me here as a visiting scholar at the Institute. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time here and on this beautiful campus with a very warm atmosphere and very inspiring scholars. So thank you for that, and thank you for being here today. I'm very excited to present my first monograph, Repertoires of Slavery, which turns to a hitherto unstudied set of anti-slavery tragedies, melodramas, ballets, operas, harlequinades, and so forth, to explore how abolitionist theater provided a site to mediate a white metropolitan and at times specifically Dutch identity. The book prizes open the conflicting ideological functions of anti-slavery discourse and thinks about the complex ways in which playwrights wielded the question of slavery to negotiate the meanings of human rights and subjection. My book unfolds three recurrent scenarios of slavery described in three substantial analytical chapters. And before I present those to you, I want to set out a brief contextual line in order to make sure that you're familiar with the historical episode I am also talking about. So if you could please move forward to the next slide. So for the sake of brevity, I've put some facts together on this slide to discuss. So as far as the Dutch economy, colonial economy is concerned, I want to note that the Dutch East and West India companies were very early on engaged in the slavery-based commodity chains and in the slave trade itself. At the pinnacle of the Dutch commercial success between 1750 and 1770, around 130,000 Africans were deported to the Dutch Caribbean under the Dutch flag. And until 1775, in fact, the enslaved population in the Dutch East Indies outnumbered those those captives in the Dutch Atlantic, and that is very often forgotten also. Importantly, both companies were financed by private means, so in the beginning not by the state, but mostly by private means. And as a consequence, they attracted a considerable number of shareholders from the Dutch middle and upper classes. Also, the companies brought immense riches to the metropole. And recent research has shown that in the 1770s, no less than 40% of all the growth of the Holland economy was in fact grounded in the Atlantic slavery-based commodity chains. That means that, of course, the slavery-based trade was very present in the Dutch metropole, and that a lot of the citizens living there were connected to it as merchants, as builders, as investors, and at the very least, as consumers of those goods. So that's very important to keep in mind. A lot of the authors also in the repertoire I'm studying were actually also investors or even owned slaves themselves. During this time also, the political landscape of the Netherlands also radically shifted. A group called themselves the Patriots criticized the near monarchical power of the House of Orange and the stadtholders. With French military aids, the Patriots successfully established the Batavian Republic, as they called it, in 1795. And this led to a lot of parliamentary discussions about a new constitution and also how the Dutch would relate to Dutch colonial economy and the slave trade, of course. Some passionate anti-slavery speeches were in fact delivered also in the parliament, and this means that the slavery discussion was already politicized in the 1790s, contrary to what is often claimed. But unfortunately, these abolitionist representatives were unable to mobilize more than a handful of fellow representatives. In the 1798, the parliament then approved a constitution that in fact nationalized trading companies, postponed the prospect of abolition, and promoted a vision of empire that saw the colonies as mere sources of income and Africans and Asians working there as essentially inferior. Economic motivations had indeed spurred racist theories that presented non-white people as unworthy and unfit for liberty. In a deluge of reports by Dutch publicists and scientists, skin color was increasingly defined as a marker of essential difference and became a proxy for subjection, whereas skin color was formally declared or explained as a consequence of the change of diet, of culture, and so forth. It was now intrinsically meaning that people were different. Nonetheless, during this era, during this Patriot era, a lot of anti-slavery publications saw the light. There were political, academic, cultural, and even scientific publications also that in these days try to claim that there was no difference between white and black people. The abolitionist, the list of abolitionist poems, plays, novels, pamphlets, reports that were written during these days is actually very impressive, and it is surprising that so little research has been done on these works. It was long claimed that slavery in the Dutch metropole was not a topic of discussion at all, but that's not the case. They were very well aware of what was happening in the colonies. Could you please move to the next slide? Thank you. So in my book, I have focused on anti-slavery theater that was created and consumed between those very crucial decades that I have just described. For the period between 1770 and 1810, I have found 16 plays that dealt with slavery in a critical manner. Naturally, these plays differ widely in scope and ideology. While some promoted moderate stance towards slavery, others were more radical. And whereas some enjoyed several decades span of popularity, others experienced a more short-lived presence on stage, only on local stages, for instance, and were primarily consumed as reading text, which was also very common in that time. My book entails 3 substantial analytical chapters, as I said, in which 3 recurring scenarios of slavery are represented. And each of these chapters, I try to do a close reading of a couple of texts. So not all of the 16 anti-slavery texts are in fact discussed in detail in my work, and here are just a couple of them. As you can also notice, here a lot of derogatory language and images were, of course, used in these texts, and I cannot avoid using these when I'm giving here a presentation on this topic. I hope to use these terms, of course, in a way that can help destructing them. In the end of my thesis, I argued that Dutch abolitionist theater both criticized and reinforced white imperial dominance as it propagated reform while ultimately facilitating symbolic forms of colonial violence and endorsing colonial politics and aesthetics. So for my first chapter called Suffering Victims, I center enslaved characters that are the object of pity for their white counterparts. The plays under scrutiny here are all bourgeois dramas and middle-class dramas that hope to inspire Dutch audiences with an anti-slavery spirit by confronting them with scenes of violence that reveal the harsh realities of slavery, often replete with slave testimonies and so forth. Crucial to this dramatic template, however, was the presence of a white bourgeois hero who could alleviate the pain and the suffering of the enslaved characters. Could you move to the next slide, please? So the most radical play in the repertoire that I have studied is called Krospelkool of Slavery, meaning Krospelkool or slavery. It was written by Dick van Hogendorp in 1800, and the play encompassed a vigorous attack on the Dutch institution of slavery in East India, which was very unique. Dick van Hogendorp himself had been actually an official in the East Indies, a VOC official, and he had become witness of the colonial corruption and abusive behavior against the enslaved population. He had written several critical pamphlets and reports, and therefore became a very unpopular figure in the colonial authoritative circles. Krospelkool was his first and only literary work. So suspicious of the play's content and very aware of the political potential of theater, which of course then was a kind of what we know as television today, was a way to directly and lively show political issues. So suspicious of what might happen on stage, the slavery lobby in fact went to Krospelkool's premiere in The Hague in March 1801. And as soon as the curtain rose, investors and officials started shouting and blowing cheap whistles, which they had bought on their way to the theater. And when the tumult got worse, the director of the play had to come on stage to call the play off eventually. However, the day after the riot, all copies of Krospelkool were immediately sold out, and the bookshops even claimed that they could have sold 10 times more if they had more copies. And one reviewer wrote an applauding piece that thanked Van Hogendorp to take such a bold stance against slavery, starting that the system was irreconcilable with the fundamental principles of the new Pagan nation. So what was this play about? The play is set in the household of a Dutch merchant, Wedano, in what is now Jakarta, then called also Batavia. He delivers passionate speeches against the colonial wrongs throughout the drama and treats his own slave as humanely as possible. And the form of humane slavery is also what is often promoted, of course, in these plays. Every day, however, when he goes out to work, his Indian sister-in-law, Krospelkool, makes a game out of brutalizing the slaves in his household. She particularly vents her fury on a 15-year-old girl named Champaka, whom she believes to be Wedano's favorite. Champaka shares with the audience on stage how she was kidnapped and sold to a slaver in Makassar, and when she does, stage directions indicate that she repeatedly bursts into tears. And it's not surprising that, especially during this scene, the lobbyists of the slavery lobbyists were at their loudest. So Champaka's testimony is very moving, but Krospelkool has no mercy. She invents the most absurd reasons to mistreat the girl. She accuses her of breaking a plate, which is also depicted on the play's frontispiece, and demands two slaves standing in the back to tie and bind Champaka to a ladder and to subsequently thereafter whip her. As Wedano gets home from work right in time, his sensitive part is shocked, and he delivers a speech about Krospelkool's lack of virtuous emotion, so very sentimental rhetoric also used in the play, of course. But he also gives a speech about the institution of slavery in general. And could you move to the next slide, please? I've always given the citations in Dutch, but I will translate, of course, for you. So Wedano goes, he says, and translations are my own, "Oh, infernal slave trade, how hideous are your effects. Nature is startled by the wrongs you produce. And can people who call themselves enlightened, who call themselves Christians, tolerate this scandalous trade, yet protect and encourage it through their own laws? And is this practiced and accepted too by my own compatriots, the good-natured Batavians? Oh, what a disgrace. However, no, it will all end soon. Self-interest, ignorance, and prejudice will yield to the innate nobleness, intelligence, and progressiveness of the Batavian or Dutch citizens. So Widano's words are clearly grafted onto Enlightenment and Christian principles, as well as onto the radical axioms of the revolutionary period in the Netherlands. He cleverly reminds his compatriots of their own beliefs. Their new Batavian Republic was indeed based on fundamental rights and principles of equality, liberty, and integrity. So now, too, they must also oppose slavery. Interestingly, Widano also presents tolerance, philanthropy, and a desire for freedom as intrinsically Dutch or Batavian characteristics, right? Eventually, Widano then sends Kraspukal packing, and he also sets Champaka free. So that was a very important performative act on stage, of course. The latter falls to Widano's knees, and she kisses his hands, and I quote, "Allow me to kneel before you and sprinkle your hands with my tears. They are tears of appreciation. I am full of gratitude." She then goes on to call Widano, and I quote again, her savior, her second father, more than a human being, and again, quote, "the representation of God on earth." And finally, she offers her eternal services to Widano as a sign of gratitude. This inspires Widano to conclude that, quote again, "the satisfaction of performing benevolent acts is much more higher than receiving them." So the strong emphasis on the pleasures of doing good was essential for bourgeois abolitionist representation, as it could, of course, convince spectators that endorsing anti-slavery causes would make them not only better humans, but also better citizens. But differently, slavery became a window of opportunity on both personal and national levels. In addition, the liberation scene reenacts the status quo. Not only did Champaka's gratitude uphold the idea of self-evident Black subordination, it also reinforced enslaved people's dependence on white benevolence and humanitarian aid. There's much more to say about this play. It's very interesting. Also, particularly interesting is the way, for instance, in which gender and race intersect in the representation of Kraspukal as a female Indian abuser, whereas of course most enslavers would be white men, white male characters. I cannot discuss this right now, but I'm happy to talk about that later. I want to move on to my next chapter, the second chapter, which is called Contented Fools. It exposes how anti-slavery sentiment generated visions of Afro-diasporic people's alleged happy-go-lucky attitude, physicality, and servility. A combination of distinct narrative tropes and performative techniques, such as distorted language, cosmetic blackface, and the stagings of plantation amusements, enabled abolitionist playwrights to fortify racial boundaries pending legal measures against slavery. The case I want to discuss here is Ritson Gijsbeek's opera, Paul in Virginia, a stage adaptation, of course, of Bernardin de Saint-Pierre's famous novel of the same name. The opera premiered in Amsterdam in 1797 and soon became a staple of the Dutch repertoire, contrary to Kraspukal, which was never staged again after the riot. Paul in Virginia revolves around the pleasures and perils of two young lovers in what is now Mauritius, where they have been raised by their two widowed mothers and a Gentile house slave named Domingo. Their bucolic life is disrupted, however, when Virginia is caught in a storm. Whereas in the novel, she dies and the novel ends with her tragic death. The opera stages how she is rescued by an enslaved man named Zabi. And Zabi is actually a very interesting character. He's portrayed here. Zabi was a runaway slave whom Paul and Virginia had met in the first act of the opera during a walk in the forest. As they noticed Zabi's story's appearance, they wipe off his head with a tissue, collect some leaves to bind his bleeding feet, and give him water to drink. Zabi then starts to sing about how he was forced by severe ill treatment to escape from a neighboring plantation. They're very moved, and Paul and Virginia eventually invite him to become their house servant and help Domingo in their households. Being offered a place as a servant for these much beloved whites, Zabi is ever so grateful and ecstatically sings that meeting Paul and Virginia is the best thing that ever happened to him. He claims that he has never been so joyful, and he doesn't know what to do with his body, so he simply dances to it. In other words, Zabi is able to banish his worries as soon as he is granted a slightly better perspective. If his inferior nature was not expressed through his short-term memory and funny movements that had to represent genuine African dance, it surely was by means of his incorrect language. Indeed, Zabi's songs were all written in a broken Dutch. It was well known in theatrical traditions to socialize and racialize characters through linguistic distortion. Full Black dialects particularly functioned as proof of Africans' backwardness and became a license for holding them in low esteem. At the same time, such practices, of course, also engendered comic relief for white audiences. Paul and Virginia is indeed filled with episodes alluding to the alleged dullness of Africans. One Black side character, for instance, is given a mirror, is tongue-tied to see his own reflection in the glass, to give just one example. In general, the opera Paul and Virginia confronted spectators with the excesses of the institution, for which morally debased planters such as Zabi's formerly brutal enslaver were to blame. Meanwhile, contented slaves such as Zabi embodied the comfortable stereotype of happy-go-lucky Africans who acknowledged the semiotics assigned to their skin color and openly expressed their eagerness to submit to benevolent white masters. It is no coincidence, of course, that these racist divisions appeared in productions that were actually critical of brutal forms of slavery. Racism indeed came to the fore in such texts as a buffer between abolitionism and actual equality. Go to the next slide. Zabi was a very digestible slave character. In fact, he became so popular that he had his own spin-off show on a winter evening in 1807. It was in a popular theater cafe called the Ooievaar, or the Stok in Dutch, I think, in Amsterdam, and it presented on the bill that it would star in the comic episode of The Black from Paul and Virginia. A review of that night suggests that a white comedian in blackface imitated the loose and droll movements representing those of a very cheerful Zabi. Without a doubt, of course, such performances in many ways foreshadows the poetics and the politics of minstrel shows that would come over from the US a few decades later. If you could go. So contented enslaved characters as Zabi obviously did not pose any threat to the slavery system. All the more so that those who actively fought their bondage. Now, my third and final chapter considers plays that grapple with slave-led resistance. These plays often channeled metropolitan anxieties about retributive violence in the colonies, thus representing rebellions as brutal and ineffective. If rebellions were staged at all, that is. Following Michel Rothriot's observations about the unthinkability of Black self-liberation, I argue that authors silence non-white forms of redress by recasting revolts to make sense to the white dominant order. I here turn to a play called the BLANKE and the ZWARTE, meaning the white and the black, basically, translated from French by Johannes Geselius in 1797. It is set on a sugar plantation in Saint-Domingue and reflects on the ongoing and very impressive insurrection that had started in August 1791. Although it is today known as the Haitian Revolution happened in a French Caribbean context, it impacted the entire Atlantic orbit, and it would also serve as an important point of reference during Dutch anti-slavery debates. In the newly established Batavian Republic, the case of Saint-Domingue allowed representatives to negotiate the question of if and how notions of liberty could be or not be extended to the enslaved populations in the colonies. So you could move to that next slide. The BLANKE and the ZWARTE opens with a spectacular dialogue between a cruel planter and his benevolent son, Boval, who warns his father that a black avenger would arise soon to violently and rightfully resist the yoke of slavery if conditions on the plantations did not ameliorate soon. Boval had a particular avenger in mind too, his best friend, Salem, who was one of the enslaved workers on his father's plantation. As a victim of repeated floggings, Salem had expressed himself extremely vengeful. And at a nocturnal meeting, he eventually also calls for a full-scale insurrection. He offers an impressive speech that ranges over multiple pages in front of his fellow insurgents. And again, I'm translating here. I am burning with vengefulness. Which of you is not? I will not attempt to encourage you or move you by outlining the brutal abuses again that haunt your minds every day. Neither will I speak of the scars that cover your bodies. No, I will not revive the cruel memories that not even time will heal. I will, however, expose the dangers you will have to endure. The plan to revolt is as dangerous as it is laudable. Whites are used to killing, while we have only suffered. They have turned warfare into a terrific sport, while we have no means but our brain, no weapons but our desperation. The speech is constructed with sweeping rhetoric and evokes both personal and shared trauma, as it calls the necessity to avenge the historical injustices that the institution of slavery has inflicted. Against a gloomy backdrop that sets the set for the fourth act, Salem then describes the tremendous combat and the noble successes on the sides of the rebels. This account of the revolt allowed Geselius, the author, to narrate actual slave-led resistance while forbearing to show the actual menace of the rebels on stage. Yet the description alone will have troubled literate audiences in the Netherlands. It will have sounded frighteningly familiar. The specter of retributive violence had haunted the metropole since a near successful uprising in Berbice in 1763 and continued to do so as rebellions in Suriname, Curaçao, and elsewhere rapidly succeeded one another. Thank you. In the colonies, slave-led opposition was violently curbed, and rebel leaders often faced the most brutal punishments imaginable. In the theater, Salem's revolt was controlled and contained too, albeit in very different manners. When he is about to personally avenge himself on Boval Sr., Boval's father, his retributive passions are miraculously tempered by his wife Zama, who openly denounces Salem's madness and utters that the violence he initiates in the name of freedom is antithetical to the humanity he solicits from his white counterparts. Seeing that Salem is willing to call off the uprising, Boval Sr. finally demands for peace and the possibility to build a new plantation based on mutual amnesty. The formally so unyielding Salem then concludes the drama by encouraging his fellows to resume their labor. And he says, and I'm translating again, brave companions, man is born to work. Let us return to the farmlands. Let us make the fields which we have damaged fertile again. Urging his companions to restore the land of Boval's fathers, Salem symbolically eliminates the possibility of challenging the status quo. Moreover, his words suggest that the fate of the enslaved ultimately lay in the hands of white abolitionists rather than in those of black vindicators, and that armed resistance, even when justified in theory, is not an effective means to achieve emancipation. The voice of the colonized, in other words, was assimilated to that of the colonizer. The BLANKE and the ZWARTE demonstrates how slave-led resistance struck fear even into ardent abolitionists, because it challenged colonial capitalism and white dominance altogether. Abolitionism had to be organized according to a white grammar. I'm coming to a conclusion now. In Repertoires of Slavery, I have attempted to chart the erratic ideological terrain of abolitionism through the lens of white-produced theater in the Netherlands around 1800. An extensive set of tropes, linguistic variations, cosmetic practices, and scenarios worked on a dramatic realm of abolitionism that hoped to mobilize audiences for a crusade against slavery. Some plays did raise awareness, and some of them I haven't mentioned here. And some were considered so radical that they even caused riots. However, this theatrical discourse of reform was less vocal than its surface suggests. The critical scenarios of slavery broadcast to Dutch reading and theater-going audiences were deeply imbued by competing discourses of profitability, racism, national identity, and the claim to human rights. While a virtual consensus in this repertoire emerged that slavery violated Christian, bourgeois, and revolutionary principles, the same repertoire emanates the belief that the plantation economy could not be abandoned because it contributed so much to the metropole's prowess. And the same repertoire also adjusted to the damaging ideas on race that propagated white European superiority vis-à-vis others. These scenarios ballooned, of course, to create and sustain the meanings of colonial operations and to guarantee a white and at times also a Dutch superiority. I do not necessarily make in this book the claim or the case for a unique or exceptional Dutch theatrical discourse of abolitionism. The plays I studied were part, indeed, of a transnational glossary that wedded a utopian rhetoric of rights with comic blackface and imperialist frames. But an important underlying aim of this book was to make a point about the entwining histories of colonial slavery and Dutch culture and identity, because there had long been an assumption that colonialism was indeed divorced from the metropole and that it left no material or mental traces. Therefore, I do want to argue that the anti-slavery repertoire sometimes hinged upon specific Dutch contexts and narratives, which it in turn also helped shape and invigorate. These plays, as well as the pictures, plots, and practices they encompass, should therefore be considered as part and parcel of what Gloria Wekker in her pivotal study, White Innocence, has termed the Dutch Cultural Archive. She argues that, like most ex-colonizing and colonizing nations, the Netherlands retains an immense reservoir of memories, figures, effects, and beliefs concerning race and colonialism that piled up during 400 years of colonial rule and that have been crucial to the production and preservation of white dominance in modern Dutch society. The Cultural Archive has systematically programmed depictions of non-white people as servile, dangerous, and laughable. And in my book, I have tried to unravel part of that process in the hopes that exposing such racist construction, even or especially in critical cultural productions, will help to finally deconstruct them. Thank you.
Yeah.